What is poverty? How should we measure it? And what needs to be done about it? Responses to each of these questions is obviously highly contested and changes how inequality is understood by sociologists and the general public, but also by policymakers responding to it. My name is Daniel Edmiston, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Leeds. In this short video, I'm going to outline why more needs to be done to explore inequalities below the poverty line, and specifically an increasing depth of poverty in high-income countries such as the UK. To do so, though, I want to argue that we have to reflect upon and confront the varying degrees of visibility that characterize current processes of social and economic change and fragmentation, but also the conceptual frameworks, data practices, and approaches adopted by sociologists interested in questions of poverty and inequality. Since the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, empirical sociology has made great headway to identify the extremes of economic advantage, both domestically and globally. This return of inequality has motivated invaluable methodological innovation and experimentation to better understand economic elites and their bearing on the social world around us and on the current climate crisis. And this is for good reason. The top 10 richest people, that is the top 10 richest men in the world, currently own more than the bottom 3.1 billion people globally. And their wealth has doubled since the pandemic began. In many ways, this body of work that it reflects on the extremes of economic advantage offers a necessary reckoning with our blind spots across the social sciences and reflects growing recognition of the need to look up to those people and places we know relatively little about. By contrast, there's been much less concerted, coordinated effort to explore marginality in the lowest ranges of the socio-economic order. And we know that this is the exception to the rule if we take a broader view of the social sciences. Historically, the sociological gaze has tended downwards towards those experiencing poverty, often neglecting those actors who have the greatest power and bearing over low-income dynamics. Today, though, comparatively less attention has been given to the changing profile and depth of poverty across late capitalist contexts such as the UK. And very often this is underpinned by or motivated by an assumption and belief that extreme degrees of privation are reserved for other places and other people outside of Europe and North America. Now, the relative lack of attention to extreme degrees of privation in high-income countries is in spite of some increasing concerns about the kind of nature of low-income dynamics that we've seen over the last decade or so. So there's increasing evidence of precarious employment, low-wage work, inadequate social protection systems, rising homelessness in certain contexts, and rising food insecurity and food bank use. Now, these trends in socio-economic restructuring and increasing financial hardship aren't currently reflected in government reporting on low incomes. In fact, there's been a flatlining in the overall poverty rate over the last 20 years, despite these upheavals in contexts such as the UK. Around 1 in 5 people are in poverty today in the UK, and that's about the same as it was 20 years ago. Now, as a result, there's been a slow but emerging recognition of the need to not just understand the proportion of people that fall below the poverty line, but also the changing structure and severity of poverty. To do so, though, a number of questions arise around the methodological and conceptual decisions that are taken by social researchers. And the one that I want to focus on here is the question of who counts when it comes to research on poverty and inequality. To answer the question of who counts, we need to have a better handle on what we're measuring. So what exactly is poverty? Well, there are a number of different ways of measuring poverty, defining it and understanding it. And each of these plausible ways of measuring it invariably informs how we think poverty can and should be addressed. So for those that take a subsistence view of poverty, will believe that this entails not having enough money to cover basic human needs such as housing, food, and warmth. For those that take a more relative understanding of poverty, they will believe that it entails not having enough resources, be they economic, social, or cultural, to participate in society, or as Peter Townsend would say, according to the standards prevailing. There are other ways of looking to understand what poverty is and how it can come to be defined and measured. A consensus-based approach to poverty is arrived at by looking at the key necessities which the general public believe no one should have to do without. And others argue that we should have a less items-based or static understanding of poverty and think about it more as a dynamic question of the power people have over different domains of their life based on their class position. In the UK context, the headline measure of poverty is one that's centred on a relative reading of low incomes. So it's the proportion of the UK population that fall below 60% of contemporary median, that is average, incomes. Now, on the screen in front of you, you will see remarkable stability in relative poverty rates in the UK, with only minor or temporary upticks over the years. Now, this is the story of poverty that captures the attention of many political leaders and policymakers in defending their track record or policy position, often rebuffing criticism by those concerned about the developments that I previously mentioned around increasing food insecurity or precarious employment. Now, this gets to the heart of some of the well-rehearsed debates about the relative merits of different approaches to poverty analysis that have highlighted a series of limitations with threshold measures of low incomes. The most central concern being that threshold indicators measure changing rates of poverty, so the proportion of people that fall below a relative poverty line, but tell us little about the changing severity of low incomes. Beyond drawing a potentially arbitrary cutoff point that has little to do with living standards or social outcomes, threshold approaches tend to assume the poor, quote unquote, can be treated as a uniform category without significant analytical coarsening or loss. For such indicators, as Amartya Sen would say, the starving wreck counts no more than the barely poor, and it's easy to construct examples in which, in an obvious sense, there is an intensification of poverty while the headcount measure is unchanged or records a diminution, a reduction. This trend is currently observable in the UK context, where headcount indicators are failing to capture a changing profile and depth of poverty. In response, there's been growing but fragmented interest in the problem of deep poverty in recent years, with a range of measures emerging to explore the low-income dynamics and living standards of those falling below the relative poverty line in the UK. Arguably one of the kind of key pioneers of this way of thinking about poverty, measuring it and recommending interventions, was Charles Booth, a key founder of empirical sociology as well. Charles Booth sought to capture a heterogeneity of conditions and experiences reflected in poverty that highlighted the structural determinants of disadvantage, but also the role of individuals and socio-demographic characteristics in shaping the opportunities of households. In the 1890s, Charles Booth led a large-scale social survey of poverty in London, and he combined statistical methods, so counting households and individuals, with ethnographic observations, and pioneered the poverty line, a threshold under which people could not afford to live a decent, independent life. Now, this isn't the relative poverty line that we use today and that the government uses as its headline indicator of low incomes, but it was a poverty line nonetheless. And based on this, Charles Booth concluded that around 30% of the population in London were living in poverty, and he visualized it through a series of maps, as you can see on the screen in front of you here. But beyond this poverty line, Charles Booth also explored varying degrees of advantage and disadvantage, and offered a thick measurement and analysis of poverty beyond a threshold to look at categorizations of the poor and different forms of class advantage and disadvantage. And in doing so, he observed different kinds and types of poverty. He looked at how many children were in a household, the age of the household, their relationship to paid work. And in doing so, Booth demonstrated what we now know and take for granted, that poverty is multidimensional in its character and effects, multidimensional in its causes, and it's systematic in the labour market and in personal circumstances, and often has a looping effect in that poverty often breeds poverty. Official statistics on poverty that are currently prevalent in high-income contexts such as the UK strip out this textured way of understanding the diversity of experiences and causes that characterize poverty and the people that are most subject to its violence. And this is important because those in deeper forms of poverty now make up a larger share of the low income distribution than they did a quarter of a century ago. In 1994, 20% of those in relative poverty had an income that fell more than 50% below the poverty line. But by 2020, this had risen to 28%. And here, according to other measures of poverty and poverty depth, you can see that the prevalence of deeper forms of poverty has increased significantly. Now, these trends are not currently captured by the government's headcount approach to distributional analysis, which obscures a changing profile of poverty in the UK. Overall, the poverty gap, that is the average distance low incomes fall below the poverty line, has steadily increased over the last 25 years, with this being particularly pronounced for those in the deepest forms of poverty. When thinking about who counts in research on poverty and inequality, it's also important to reflect on the social groups that are worst affected. And here I want to focus in particular on minority ethnic people in the UK context. So poverty remains stubbornly high amongst Black and minority ethnic people in Britain today. Official statistics suggest that there have been very minor improvements in BME poverty rates over the last decade. However, if we look below the poverty line, a much more varied picture of social progress emerges. In 2010, around 1 in 5 white people were in relative poverty compared to around 2 in 5 BME people. And a slight reduction, a very minor reduction of 1 percentage point in the overall poverty rate of BME people over the last 10 years is principally driven by changing poverty risk amongst mixed and Asian ethnic minority groups. Despite this, though, the depth of poverty has increased considerably for those below the poverty line. Since 2010, the poverty gap, that is the average distance incomes fall below the poverty threshold, has grown for all groups, but the severity of poverty has worsened for BME people, particularly. And as a result, the risk of falling into deep poverty is much greater amongst minority ethnic people. Not only this, but food insecurity is considerably higher. Black people are more than twice as likely as white people to experience food insecurity, and these differences grow when focusing on severe food insecurity exclusively. Despite making up around 15% of the population, more than a quarter, 25.4% of those in deep poverty are from a Black, Asian, or minority ethnic background, according to the latest available data. And rather than social progress or steps forwards, this represents a step backwards in terms of ensuring redistributive justice is underpinned by racial justice. In part, these differences in the prevalence and risk of deep poverty are explained by differential exposure to low-wage work and considerable changes to the tax benefit system over the last decade. These systematically disadvantage ethnic minority groups, particularly those most reliant on working age social security, to top up their incomes and earnings amidst a cost of living crisis. On the screen in front of you, you can see that the working age population now receives just over £1,000 less on average in cash benefits than they did a decade ago. But this rises to £1,377 less on average for ethnic minority people, and even higher to £1,730 on average for Black people compared to 2010. These dynamics, these trends, are not currently observable in mainstream measures adopted by the UK government on low incomes and through distributional analysis. The final issue that arises when thinking about who counts in poverty research is the question of who is actually counted and reflected in official statistics. Now, official statistics measure, but also create governable populations of value to national interests and political objectives. As a function of statecraft, population statistics offer a means through which to aggregate information on people and design public policies according to the social categories deemed relevant or strategically necessary. Understood in this way, statistical regimes come to be recognized as regimes of knowing and unknowing population, generating possibilities for the erasure or the visibility of social phenomena, forming the basis for welfare state intervention or disavowal. Now, across high-income countries such as the UK, income surveys used to construct official poverty statistics typically identify private households as their target population. As a result, those not living in private households are currently excluded from the sampling frame of population income surveys across many high-income countries, and in turn, the distributional analysis undertaken to examine not just poverty, but also deep poverty and the social policies conceived to tackle it. Now, one might think that such practices are justifiable given that the population subgroups that are missing are relatively small and therefore unlikely to have much bearing on estimates of poverty prevalence, trends, or determinants. However, there are a number of reasons why this missing minority need to be recognised as a crucial omission in poverty statistics and analysis. First, the size of the missing minority in poverty statistics is non-trivial. It's around 2% of the UK population, and it's growing, albeit unevenly. Young people, those in communal establishments, institutionalized populations, those experiencing homelessness or insecure accommodation, and recent immigrants are all groups that have grown across not just the UK, but Europe since 2010. And according to the best available data, more than 6.6 million people across Europe are not living in private households, an estimated 1.3% of the overall population in Europe. This is the equivalent to the combined population of Denmark and Cyprus. So the first reason that we should be concerned is the size of this missing minority. The second reason is that the missing minority are much more likely than the general public to display serious levels of poverty, including destitution and low well-being. Now, if the majority of those missing are more likely to experience not just poverty, but deep poverty, their absence relative to the whole population may initially appear fairly minor, but as a proportion of the low-income population, these rates become cumulatively quite significant, particularly if we're interested in exploring the changing structure and severity of poverty. The third reason is that there's evidence to suggest that those missing or underrepresented in official poverty statistics are more likely to be women, people experiencing limiting health conditions or disabilities, larger families, migrants, and those from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, groups that we know are more likely to suffer from multiple compounding disadvantages over the life course. So attention to this missing minority has the capacity to complicate our understanding of low-income lives and the analysis we undertake as sociologists. Which prompts the question, are we only interested in the poverty experienced by those that are more readily visible and able to be counted? The answer is, of course, not, but empirical researchers and policymakers often fall into the trap of appraising phenomena based on that which is deemed viable or visible. Much more than merely technical or pragmatic decisions about those outside the scope of study, these are theoretical and normative judgments about who counts and about who should come to be recognised as worthy of counting when researching poverty and inequality. The epistemic erasure that's committed through such processes routinely features in and systematises a policy blindness to extreme marginality for some of the most vulnerable social groups in contexts such as the UK, where these data practices are prevalent. So why does this matter within the current context, particularly with an increasing cost of living and growing holes in our social safety net and welfare state? Well, moving beyond a headcount or threshold approach to poverty measurement, we can see that inequalities below the poverty line have increased significantly. Those with the least have lost out the most over the last 10 years, and as a result, there's been an increasing depth of poverty in the UK. Alongside this, there is also a changing demographic composition of poverty, with women, children, larger families, Black people, and those in full-time work some of the worst affected. And this is just the sampled population that is currently reflected in official statistics. So just to conclude and draw together some of the kind of key ideas that have been covered in this video. At the moment, dominant methods of poverty measurement and analysis render certain groups more socially legible than others in welfare policy and politics. So white, domiciled, non-disabled citizens are much more visible and readily counted than women, migrants, Black, Asian, minority ethnic people, mobile populations, and people experiencing limiting health conditions or disabilities. And as sociologists, we need to ensure all social groups are both analytically and empirically legible in poverty analysis if we are to fully understand deepening inequalities, not just in the UK, but also globally and further afield. On a routine basis, public resources and state intervention are conceived based on that which is deemed visible or viable to measure, and failing to account for those that are missing from official poverty statistics or glossed over in poverty analysis with a tendency to focus on headcount approaches means researchers, particularly empirical sociologists, risk reproducing the very exclusions and symbolic misrecognition that's implicated in extreme disadvantage. This doesn't just limit the scope of research questions surrounding poverty and inequality, but also our capacity to design effective policies addressing poverty and deep poverty, prioritizing resources where they are most urgently needed. Thank you for listening to this presentation. If you'd like to find out more about some of the topics that have been discussed in it, you can visit this website. And there are also a selection of references to articles that may be of interest to you here.